everyone, so excited to share with you the start of my new painting, Three Doves. In this video, you'll see how I prepare my canvas and complete the underpainting. First thing I do is spread a very thin layer of walnut oil over my canvas, which is a wooden panel. Find just the right angle to see if you've missed any spots with the walnut oil. Once the canvas is covered with walnut oil, now you can cover it with some transparent oil paint. Here I'm going to be using transparent oxide brown oil paint by Rembrandt. I'm using an old paintbrush and a piece of cloth, it's a polyester cloth, to spread the paint around the canvas. I'm not looking for any kind of specific pattern or texture. I'm just randomly pushing the paint around, making sure it's spread evenly and thin without any bumps or textures from the paintbrush. I like a smooth surface in which to complete my underpainting on top of. I do, however, like the illusion of texture. So here I'm kind of making this sort of leather looking, maybe it's kind of marble looking texture, but there's no raised areas of paint. It's all very smooth and flat. It's a good idea to paint the sides of the canvas just in case they show a little bit through. If you frame it or if you hang it without a frame, it's nice to have a covered area on the edges so that it doesn't stand out white against the wall or against the painting itself. If your paint's feeling a little stiff, you can add a touch of walnut oil or even walnut oil gel to help soften it and allow you to push it around. And a small bit of paint goes a really long way. Even though this is a large canvas, it didn't require a lot of paint to cover the surface. I'm going to paint in a very simple grid. I like to find the center point, which is the 50% mark of the grid, and then I will be finding a 25% mark and a 75% mark. So what that ends up being is 3 vertical lines and 3 horizontal lines, all evenly spaced. And my reference image is also set up with these same marks. The grid is the same on the reference image on my computer screen to the right as what I am creating on my canvas. And I like creating my grid with the same paint that I do the underpainting with, so that as I'm putting the underpainting down, the grid just automatically disappears into the painting. I'm using a ruler to keep my lines straight. You could also use a T-square. Keeping the paint thin on the canvas allows you to manage the grid without too much mess. It's a little messy, but I think it's worth the effort. Just when you're finished, make sure that you wipe your ruler or T-square off. Grids can be helpful when you are trying to get the same proportions from a smaller reference onto a larger canvas. However, grids can be simple, they can be more complicated. It just depends on your kind of temperament and how you like to start. Sometimes my grid consists only of 1 vertical line and 1 horizontal line. It just depends what I feel like I might be needing. But with the 3 figures, I thought it would be good at least to have 3 vertical lines. That way I really have something to go by, because I'm going to zoom in on my reference image as I get further into the sketch. That will allow me to better see that my proportions are correct. You'll notice there's 2 brown edges on the left and right edge of the canvas. There's going to be 2 wooden accents that cover that area, so I made them darker so I could remember as I'm putting down the underpainting that this area is going to have wood on top of it. It's almost like a frame is going to cover that area up. So I don't need to include it. Now, the reference image on the computer screen has been sized to follow the lighter areas that you see here on my canvas. It's a ratio on the computer of the canvas size. It's not the actual canvas size, but it is the same ratio, so that everything that I do when I start to blow up the image on the computer screen will follow the same orientation of the canvas. Here's the finished grid and a look at my setup. I'm starting the underpainting using the same transparent oxide brown paint that I covered the canvas in. The canvas is still wet. The oil paint that I put down is wet and can be easily moved around and incorporated into the underpainting. I'm putting down only big shapes, no details. So I'm just looking to get something down to start. I go into this part of the underpainting, the very beginning, knowing that whatever I put down more than likely is going to be wrong. It's going to need to be adjusted and altered. So it's just kind of a warm up for my brain, eye, hand coordination. I like to start without too much measuring, just to kind of get into my groove and feel good about putting paint on the canvas. I'm essentially drawing with paint. I'm using a somewhat small brush, but it's like, I don't know, I think it was a size 6, size 4, something in that world. It's somewhat soft. It's not a bristle brush. These are synthetic brushes that have it's in between a sable and a hog's hair. It's not too stiff, it's not too soft. It's right in the middle. But I love the feeling of painting into this somewhat wet surface. It's not extremely wet, but the paint does move around fairly easily. And it just allows you to not worry about going too fast, because I'm a pretty slow painter. But this should stay wet for at least 2 days. All right, time to use the grid and my proportion tool. So I'm going to find the same size grid on my computer monitor as what I have on my canvas. This will allow me to use one-to-one measuring. I don't have to do any math. I don't have to set my proportion tool to adjust for the scale up or scale down situation that may be happening. I like to keep things super simple. Painting is hard enough without having to throw figuring out math in there. I'd rather just work on finding the size and putting the proportion tool onto the canvas from the monitor and knowing they're the same. Now, I like to complete one figure at a time. This allows me to know that it's going to stay wet while I'm working on it. It could take 1 to 2 days for me to really nail down a figure, but you have time. So if you work on the one, just capturing the big shapes, no details, you should be able to get it done within at least a day or two. Once I complete the first figure, I can move on to the second figure, and while I'm working on the second and even the third figure, the first one will be drying. So when I get finished with the third figure, for sure, the first one will be completely dry, and then you could start painting with color right on top of it. As far as my reference image goes, this is a photograph that I took. I was in Kansas at a Western photo shoot, and once I had this in the computer, I went through some editing and filtering in the Photoshop app so that I could really simplify the photograph. I didn't want a lot of details, and I wanted to obscure the faces a bit, so I did a lot of that in Photoshop before I started working with this reference. I'm painting my adjustments pretty much directly on top of the drawing that I had started with, and I can see that I was quite a bit off, especially with the head. I also jotted down on a piece of paper the zoom percentage that I ended up working with on my computer monitor so that I wouldn't have to find it again later on once I start painting. So make sure you write down the percentage of zoom once you find the correct size of your grid. I know some people like to start their paintings with charcoal drawings as the underpinning, but I like to start with paint and a paintbrush because I see better in mass as opposed to line. So I find it easier in my brain to start with a painting like this rather than trying to put down the charcoal drawing. And then I know you can fix the charcoal, but I find that it's such a mess and gets mushed into my paint. And I've tried it before and it doesn't suit my temperament. So if you're like me and you think more in terms of mass, then this may be a good option for you in starting your paintings. I find that there's really no wrong or right way to do a painting. There's the way that works for you. You're the master of your painting and you have to try on a few different techniques to find the ones that suit you best. It's a good idea to keep a notebook handy when you're beginning and starting out as a new painter so that you can remember that you tried certain things and you didn't like it. Maybe you can make notes about what you did like or didn't like about a technique. And maybe after you've tried a few, you can keep a list of the things that you like versus the things you don't like. It's just a good idea when you're first starting out to make notes of these things, because as you progress through the years, you may forget that you tried something earlier on. So not only do I think in mass at this point, I'm able to also adjust the values. So I'm working here in this underpainting stage with the drawing and laying down the values, establishing the value pattern, which also can be thought of as establishing my darker areas versus my lighter areas. If you are using a photographic reference, it may be helpful for you to turn it into a black and white or a sepia, like a monochrome image, so that you can really focus on seeing the values and the drawing without the distraction of color. I had taken this reference image a few years ago, and I have lots of files stored away, ready for use at any moment once a story comes into my mind and I know I can use that specific reference image to tell the story. I'd say 99% of my paintings, unless it's a portrait, is about telling a story. I really love the idea of having a solid story to develop the image by. And how I came to this story was I was watching an old Western movie, which I like to do. And the idea of the soiled dove, which is an old term from the 1800s that means prostitute. And I forget the name of the movie, but this one girl had found her way into that life and had been rescued away from it and then ended up being dragged back to it by the people that ran the brothel. And then she had to be rescued again. So I remembered I had this image of these three pretty sufficiently self-sustaining cowgirls. And I thought that could be an interesting story idea to tell a story of these three doves. And I'm calling them three doves as opposed to three soiled doves because they're going to return to their former self, their more pure self, without the brothel and the men overseeing their life, basically. And they have gone off, gotten away from it, and have no way, no one's going to capture them and bring them back to that lifestyle. They're going to continue to live out the rest of their days as free, self-sufficient women. All right, day 2, we're starting the underpainting, continuing the central figure here. Now you may notice with the first figure, if you can see here on the computer monitor, she doesn't have the fox fur on her shoulder. I have added that into the composition. I could see, based on just the little information that I had, and especially value-wise, that I needed something there to break up the rhythm in the figures because everything was so similar with the line across their chest from their bustier tops. And I felt, even though I had the gun belt there with the bullets in it, I wanted something else to break up that line a little bit more substantially, and the fox fur was added after the fact. And that's something that I can't stress enough. You're not a slave to this reference photo. It's just that. It's a little bit of a reference. There's some information there to start, but it's your job as the master of your painting to develop it into something better, into something more that was, more than the photo could have been. Otherwise, if the photo was good, just, print that out, hang it on the wall, and call it a day. But I wanted to elevate the photo and bring that painting up to something more interesting. Now, as I'm completing these figures, I'm also working in the fence that's behind them. I need to see the values that surround them in order to develop the values on them or inside them. The transparent oxide brown is the color I chose because I wanted some of this natural reddish brown color to show through. I'm going to be using more muted grays throughout the majority of the painting, and I thought this would add a nice under warmth. I mean, no matter how thickly you paint and cover up your underpainting, there's going to be one or two little small bits that show through. Now, I'm going to allow more of the underpainting to show through on the ground and somewhat in the shadows. The transparent oxide brown also works really well with flesh tones, so I don't have to fight against any colors that won't work well in flesh. So as you're deciding what color to use in your underpainting, it's a good idea to think about, the colors that you're going to be painting on top of it and what will work well. So these faces are pretty small, maybe 1.5 inches to 2 inches, and placing the shadow shapes will help to really establish the proportion and the vantage point at which the viewer is seeing these three women, which it appears that our vantage point is somewhat from below, if not directly in front of them. And I want to use the shadow shapes in the face to help determine this. And also will tell the viewer where the light source is coming from. And in this case, I'm emphasizing that the light's coming from the top right, which is going to create some shadows under the nose, under the chin, also shadows to their left against the fence. It's always a good idea to understand where the light source is coming from in your reference, or if you're working from life. Also, you probably can see it pretty clearly if you're working from life, but in your painting, it's good to establish a strong direction of light. In capturing a reference photo, it's best if you have good shadow shapes appearing on your subject. In other words, if it's a overcast day, you may not have a good shadow pattern. Also, to that extent, in the opposite direction, if it's a very sunny, high noon situation, you may have too much shadow. So you have to be able to manage those situations in order to capture a better reference image. If you can't, and you're working from an overcast image, let's say, things can appear very flat. So you're going to want to make up for that in your painting by creating a strong light source and developing those shadow shapes. Working into the walnut oil covered surface, you can scratch into the paint with the tip of the paintbrush like you see me doing here. You can use rubber spatulas. You can use the cloth. You can use kneaded eraser. All these types of things can help you carve into your underpainting, creating the shapes and textures that you like. This is the time to play and experiment And I've even taken fabric such as lace and pushed it into the areas where it was more covered with paint and then peeled it back to create a really interesting lace pattern. Just get creative with it and have fun. It's a good idea to periodically wipe off the tips of the proportion tool or whatever piece of equipment you may be using to measure, especially if you are pushing it against your monitor, because that can create a little bit of a mess. So at the end of a painting session, I tend to wipe off the monitor pretty good so that no paint dries on top. Now, just a little side note, if you are working from life, you can still create an underpainting this way. You probably won't need a grid though. What you will be using is more of a comparative measuring or sight size, which never been a big fan of sight size. I do, however, use comparative measuring when I work from life. And I have a video of painting my self-portrait from life, which you can also check out. 2 figures completed, and now we're going to start the 3rd figure. As far as the timeline goes here, the first day I pretty much did the canvas preparation, putting the paint down in a thin layer, and then drawing with paint the first figure. That was all completed in day 1. And now we're still on day 2, which I have now done the central figure and will hopefully be able to finish the 3rd figure. This little short segment here is actual time. It's not sped up, so you can see how slow I actually do paint. If you really take your time and complete the underpainting with a solid drawing, make sure that the drawing is correct before you leave the underpainting. Even if you have to sand away or put a little turpentine on a cloth and rub out an area, it's important to make those corrections now. Color is its own animal, and it's going to require a lot of concentration and mixing. And if you can only think about color when you're working with color, you've already figured out the drawing, you've already figured out the values, then that can be a way of compartmentalizing and making the task of completing a painting a little bit less daunting. So divide and conquer. Even though I am using a grid and a proportion tool, I still like to stand back and assess the composition from afar. If things are put down exactly as they are on the monitor from the photo reference, that's good and all, but we are creating a painting, so don't be afraid to move things or make things better for the composition or the value patterns. So when you stand back and you look at the painting, just kind of forget about the photo reference and ask yourself questions. What if? What if I move this or add that? Like for instance, when I added the fox, I put that in on the painting. I didn't even do it on the photo in Photoshop, which I could have done. There's a little less risk involved doing it that way. However, I just wanted to see it on the painting with the other figures and things there. It really drives home the idea that I think it was a good choice and I'm going to leave it. If I developed the painting and I decided after adding the 2nd and 3rd figure that the fox area, that I added there on her shoulder wasn't a good idea or wasn't necessary, then I could always take it away, either by sanding it away or with color. You can paint over things like that. But the whole point is just to always be asking yourself, what if, how can I make it better? How can I add to the story element? These are things that you want to constantly be thinking about and asking yourself as you complete the underpainting. Even though this is a figurative painting, with seeing that I have 3 figures, the star of the show, the area that I most want the viewer to pay attention to, are are not their faces, believe it or not. That's not the focal point for me. What I'm going to be driving the viewer to view most, what is the star of the show here? Who's the main character? Well, it's their hands and the guns and their bustiers, the whole center of the figure on all three figures. That's the area that I'm going to really think about having the highest degree of contrast in, and with color, maybe the more saturated color, so it really drives the viewer to focus on that area first, and then we'll fan out or go through the painting in different directions depending on how I lay out the value structure. So keeping that in mind as I developed the body and the center area, and then when I got into the face, I decided also I don't want the face to be the focal point, so I'm going to keep the eyes kind of obscured, hidden away a little bit in shadow, especially with their hats. It allows me to really do that well because the hat's going to create a shadow across the eyes, and then you'll see the nose and the mouth a little bit more. But I think this really helps to, again, make the focal point about the hands and the bustiers as opposed to the faces. So in the underpainting, I'm thinking about developing volume in my figures. I don't want them to appear flat. I'm also looking to put interesting textures. So some of the paint will be a little thicker, but it's not really raised on the canvas. Like if you run your hand across it, it's going to feel pretty smooth. But I do like the idea of some texture, and especially in the darker areas, I don't want these areas to appear completely flat. I like to be able to see through the dark areas a little bit. And you notice that sometimes with old masters such as Rembrandt. A lot of times he would complete an underpainting using similar colors to this, like a reddish brown, and those underpainted areas in the shadows often were just left as underpainting showing through to depict the shadow. He didn't paint shadow colors or opaque colors on top of them, and that allows the light to penetrate through the shadow. So the light goes in and is somewhat absorbed into the canvas that way. As opposed to when you start putting down thicker, more opaque paint, this is going to catch the light and bounce it back into the viewer's eye. So it creates more of a 3D illusion. It gives you a more volumetric illusion. So if you can develop the shadow areas, the dark areas in the underpainting with the idea that perhaps you'll be leaving them to stand alone in the finished painting, and then combined with the opaque passages, you can really punch up the level of volume in the painting. And if you've developed your underpainting and you have a really solid drawing and really solid value structure, you may only need to glaze on top of the finished underpainting in areas where you want to bring up more color or just develop a bit more of the painting, maybe a sky area or some color in the background. A lot of times, in order to show the drawing from the underpainting, you can just do a thin wash or a glaze on top of it, and this allows the underpainting drawing to show through even though you've glazed on top of it. Glazing on top of underpaintings was often done by masters in the Renaissance period. A lot of times they would put down an underpainting in the way of a grisaille, which is more of a black and white gray scale underpainting as opposed to any color, and then they would glaze color on top of the gray scale painting. And once a layer of glaze dries, then you can always put another layer of glaze on top of it. Often the Renaissance masters would have many layers of glazes. A glaze is often used in a shadow area if you want to add a touch of color without developing an opaque passage. Glazes work well with transparent oil paints, and you can just add a touch of a medium such as the walnut oil. or you may have a gel, something like that, made for glazing. So I've been developing my Western painting series for about 3 years now, and it's always a good idea, I find, to work in series. So if you have ideas about paintings and you can create at least 10 or so that could develop a specific series that you like, then that's always a good idea. And I like to keep a notebook too, so if I develop the Western series, I may have an idea that doesn't suit the Westerns. I can develop that in a notebook for later down the road if I want to start a different series. I left the hands to be developed at the end. So, I completed each figure, but I kind of just really vaguely suggested where the hands would go because I want to take my time and really do a good drawing of the hands, especially since it's going to be the focal point. So this is an area where you're going to have a high degree of detail and a high degree of color. It's going to be the area with the highest level of saturation. So as we move outward to, away towards the head, towards the feet, things are going to get less saturated and less detailed the further away we go from this specific point where the hands and the bustiers lie. This area had already dried, so I'm going to be trying to rub out some of it, scratch out some of it with the palette knife here. It doesn't have to be perfectly removed. I am going to be painting somewhat opaquely on top of the hands, but I do want to be able to have a drawing put down without too many distracting lines. So scrape away, sand away. You can use turpentine. The pure turpentine works well to push back some of the paint lines if they're pretty strongly applied from the initial underpainting. But use the things that you need to develop this area and get it ready for some high level of detail. If you would like to see more of my Western art series, you can find them on westernsinwood.com. That's westernsinwood.com. Also, you can check out in the description all the ways in which you connect with me. Hands can be quite expressive. It's a good opportunity to tell the story even more through the position of the hands. I want them to be rugged yet elegant, if that's possible. If you're working from a reference image that doesn't show the hands very clearly, it may be a good idea to either work with a mirror and have your hand held in the position that you're painting and you can paint it from life, or you can have someone take a photo of your hand in the position that you need to work on. But you really should have a strongly clear image to work from. I find that beginning painters, when working with hands, I think one of the top mistakes that I see is the placement of the thumb too high up, closer to the finger arc. There is an arc where the fingers live at the top of the palm, and the thumb kind of comes out from the base, much lower than the upper arc of the fingers. So be mindful of the placement of the thumb on your hands. I also have found it helpful to think of the fingers as not like round sausages. They're more like elongated rectangles. They have top, bottom, and sides. So if you think about it that way, it may help in developing the value structure in the hands. Also, to help you develop the perspective of the hands, use the fingernails. The fingernails really help to set the perspective. Here I am really focusing on developing the shadow structures of the gun, which will allow me to better see the fingers on the hand. So here we are in the central figure, and I'm using the back end of my paintbrush to kind of scrape off some paint in certain areas to allow this finger to take shape. So you can really see here that I have some nice hard edges, I have some lost edges, I have some blurred edges, even just here in the focal point, which we said earlier was going to be the hands with the gun and the bustier areas. That's the focal point. So again, this is where I want the highest degree of contrast and the highest degree of detail. And once we get into color, the most saturated color will be here. During the underpainting phase, be mindful of your transitions. You want the areas from the dark planes to move towards the lighter planes gradually. So you don't want to have very strong steps in between. You can initially, but then you want to soften those transitions so it reads as, for instance, if you complete the underpainting in a very thought out way with beautiful transitions, you technically could hang your underpainting as a finished painting, and that's sort of my goal here. So let's think about this again. In the underpainting, you want to first develop the drawing, you want to establish value patterns, and then you also want to be mindful of the transitions throughout the underpainting, and you want to have a variety of edges. You want some lost edges, some found edges, some hard edges, some blurred edges, some broken edges. You want all the edges. And then something that I like to develop in my underpaintings is texture. Now that's not something that everyone's underpainting will necessarily need. It just depends on sort of your painting style and end result that you're going for. Now I know, especially in this story that I'm telling here with the three doves, I do think having a high degree of texture and making it so they're not so clean and perfectly painted. I want some roughness and some grit, if you know what I'm saying, in this painting, since it's a depiction of a Western scene. These three women are strong and capable, yet also beautiful and elegant. These three doves will not be taken captive and held against their will ever again. They will remain free and on their own and able to sustain life in the West the way that they see fit. You can see here there's just a slight remnants of grid line going through the base of the gun there. So it was easily covered up as I developed the underpainting, so I don't have to worry about any grid lines showing through. So that worked well, making the grid out of the oil paint. All right, so let's finish up the hands and see what we end up with for our underpainting. So here we have our three figures. They are completed, but perhaps we could develop the story a little bit further in the background. And here I have added in the upper left area a storm and a crow on the fence, or a raven, and there's some other birds flying away like they were disturbed by something coming, some sort of menacing something. Could just be a storm, could be the men from the brothel coming to see if they can reclaim their doves. We won't know. You'll have to finish the story in your own mind. And I think that's the fun part of storytelling in painting. It's up to the viewer how they complete the story. All right, so stay tuned for the second part of this, where I will show you how I add the color on top of this Western three doves. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.